85 missed calls. That is what I saw when I picked up my phone at 6:15 in the evening after the longest nap I had ever taken on my own couch. 85, not a typo, not a glitch. 85 individual calls spread across 2 hours and 40 minutes, from numbers I recognized and numbers I didn't, from cousins who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, from my uncle who still didn't know how to use voicemail, and from one number I had not saved but recognized instantly, my grandmother's landline. The number she had owned since before I was born. I stood in my kitchen holding that phone, and I did not call anyone back. Not yet. I set it face down on the counter, and I went to check on my daughter, Lily, who was 6 years old and had fallen asleep that afternoon in the guest room with her shoes still on and her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. She was not in the guest room anymore. She was sitting at the bottom of the stairs in her socks, her rabbit dangling from one hand, looking up at me with the kind of calm that only small children and very old people ever manage to project, the kind that suggests they have already processed something the rest of us are still catching up to. I crouched down to her level. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Mama, I heard something. I want to tell you how we got here." Because 85 missed calls and a 6-year-old sitting at the bottom of the stairs with that look on her face, that is not the beginning of this story. That is the moment everything I had spent 3 years quietly building finally stopped being a secret. My name is Nora Scott. I am 38 years old. My daughter's name is Lily, and she is the sharpest, most observant child I have ever met in my life, which is either a blessing or a consequence of being raised largely by a woman who learned very early that paying attention is the only real protection you have. Let me start with my grandmother, Dolores Huang. She is 81 years old, and she is my father's mother, which makes her my blood grandmother, the biological kind, not the step kind, not the married-in kind. My father, Gordon Huang, passed away 6 years ago, just 3 months before Lily was born, which means Dolores and I share the kind of grief that should bond people. For a while, I believed it did. Dolores has money, real money, the kind that accumulates quietly over 60 years of real estate decisions and frugal living, and a late husband who understood compound interest in a way most people never do. She owns 4 rental properties in the valley, a commercial space on Renner Street that she leases to a dry cleaner and a small insurance office, and a primary residence that she paid off in full in 1991. I know these things not because she told me, but because my father told me, years before he died, and because I am the kind of person who pays attention. What she owns, collectively, is worth somewhere in the range of $2.4 million, depending on the market on any given afternoon. I know this because I had a quiet conversation with a real estate attorney named Daniel Ose about 14 months before that afternoon of 85 missed calls. That conversation happened in his office on a Tuesday morning in January, and what Daniel told me that day changed the direction of everything that followed. But I am getting ahead of myself. Dolores remarried 9 years ago. His name is Frank Bellamy. Frank is not my grandfather. Frank is not related to me by blood, by law, or by anything other than the fact that my grandmother chose him after 30 years of widowhood, and I was expected to accept that choice without comment. I accepted it. Frank is pleasant enough in the way that men who have always had women manage their emotional labor tend to be pleasant. He smiles, he tells the same 4 stories on rotation, he pats people on the shoulder. He has 2 adult children from his first marriage, a son named Derek Bellamy and a daughter named Connie Bellamy Walsh, and they were both very warm toward Dolores from the moment she and Frank became serious. Connie especially. Connie is 44 years old, she works in commercial real estate leasing, and she has a way of touching Dolores on the forearm when she talks to her that looks like affection but functions like territory marking. I noticed this the first time I met her, at a dinner at Dolores' house about 8 years ago, and I filed it away the way I file most things, quietly, without comment, without letting it show on my face. I had Lily on my own. Lily's father and I were together for 3 years and engaged for 8 months of that, and then he was not in our lives anymore, and that is as much detail as that chapter of my life requires. What matters is that when Lily was born, I was 32 years old, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town, I was working as a contracts manager for a mid-sized logistics company, and I was, by most of my family's estimation, a woman who had made a series of unfortunate choices and was doing her valiant best to recover from them. That is how Dollars saw me. I know this because she said it, more or less exactly, at Lily's first birthday party. I had arranged a small gathering at my apartment, just family, just the people who mattered, and Dollars sat across from me at my kitchen table while Lily smeared frosting on a paper plate, and she said, in a tone that I think she believed was kind, "Nora, I want you to know that even though things haven't gone the way any of us hoped, you're managing beautifully. Truly. Your father would be proud of how well you're coping." Coping, that was the word she chose. As though my life were a disaster I was enduring rather than a life I was building with intention. I smiled at her over Lily's head. I did not correct her. That same week, I had signed the paperwork on a consulting contract that would pay me $43,000 over 6 months, my first major independent client after I had quietly begun doing contract work on the side. I did not mention it. I just smiled and thanked her for coming. That is the kind of woman I am. I do not correct people who underestimate me. I just keep building. The pattern was established early and it never really varied. Dollars believed, genuinely and with what I think was complete sincerity, that I was a woman to be managed, advised, steered, occasionally assisted, and generally treated as someone whose judgment could not quite be trusted. My father had been her favorite child, her golden one, and when he died, I think some part of her transferred onto me the grief and the protectiveness and the condescension all at once. As though I were a fragile thing he had left behind rather than a grown adult woman with her own mind and her own resources. She offered to help me with Lily's medical bills when Lily was 2 and had a respiratory infection that required a specialist, a pediatric pulmonologist named Dr. Amara Osaibansu at the Regional Children's Hospital. The bills were real and the visit was necessary, but I had already handled it. Lily was on my employer's health insurance at the time, a solid plan with a manageable deductible, and I had the specialist covered. When Dollars offered the money, her voice had that particular softness that people use when they are trying very hard to be gracious about someone else's failure. I thanked her and told her it was already sorted. She looked surprised in a way she could not quite conceal. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't mind, Nora, really." "I'm sure," I told her. She patted my hand. I smiled. I had just renewed Lily's coverage during open enrollment the week before and upgraded the plan to include vision and additional specialist access because I had done the math and it cost me $62 more per month and was worth every cent. I did not explain any of that to Dollars. I just smiled and let her believe what she was going to believe anyway. The second incident that matters happened about 8 months later, when Connie Bellamy Walsh, who had, by this point, become a more or less permanent fixture at Dollars' house on weekends, mentioned, in a group conversation after Sunday dinner, that she knew someone at an accounting firm who was looking for administrative support. "Nothing glamorous," Connie said, addressing me specifically in the way that people address you when they think they are doing you a favor. "But it's stable. Good benefits. I could put in a word if you're interested." I was, at that moment, 14 months into running my own contracts consulting practice on the side of my full-time job. I had 3 clients. My billings for that quarter were higher than my annual salary from 3 years prior. I had a meeting scheduled for the following Thursday with a 4th potential client, a logistics company that would become, over the next 2 years, my largest and most consistent account. "That's so thoughtful," I told Connie. "I'll keep it in mind." She nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who has done their good deed. I excused myself to get more water from the kitchen, and while I stood at the sink, I thought about the Thursday meeting and what I needed to prepare, and then I went back to the table and listened politely for another 40 minutes. The third incident, and this one mattered more than the others, because it was the first time Dollars said something that touched Lily directly, happened when Lily was 4 years old. Lily had started at a small private preschool that I had chosen carefully and researched thoroughly. It was not the closest option, and it was not the cheapest, but it had the developmental approach I wanted for her, and it had a waiting list, which told me what I needed to know about its reputation. When Dollars found out what I was paying for the tuition, she got very quiet in that particular way she has. Not angry, exactly, but measuring. "Is that really the best use of your money right now, Nora?" she asked. "There are very good public pre-K programs. Lily would be just as well served, and you could put that money towards something more practical." Lily was sitting 3 feet away, playing with a set of stacking blocks, and she looked up at the word practical the way small children look up when they hear a word they recognize but cannot place. I looked at my daughter and then I looked at my grandmother and I said, very calmly, "I've run the numbers. It works for us." Dollars made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite acceptance. That same week, I had a conversation with a financial advisor named Benny Casalucci at an independent planning firm, and I opened a 529 educational savings account for Lily with an initial deposit of $8,000. I had been adding to it consistently since. By the time of 85 missed calls, it had grown to $67,000. Dollars did not know it existed. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. Not the silence of defeat. The silence of someone who has decided that the best argument is not the one you make out loud. Now let me tell you what I built, and why I kept it quiet, and how close I came twice to having it surface before I was ready. By the time Lily turned 5, my consulting practice was no longer a side arrangement. I had left my full-time position 14 months earlier and taken the leap that terrified me in a way I will never fully be able to explain to anyone who has not done it. I had 3 anchor clients, a 4th that came on within 60 days of going independent, and a reputation in logistics contracting circles that had grown entirely through referrals. I did not advertise. I did not have a website that anyone in my family knew about. I had a professional network and I had results and I had a business bank account that was, by any reasonable measure, doing well. I kept it quiet for a reason that is simpler than people assume when I explain it. I kept it quiet because I had watched, my entire adult life, how Dollars treated things she knew about. She managed them. She offered opinions. She suggested adjustments. She introduced her own people and implied that their judgment was more reliable than mine. The one thing in my life that was entirely mine, that I had built from nothing with no family involvement and no family money and no family approval, I was not going to hand her the opportunity to put her fingerprints on it. So I kept it quiet and I kept building. And when family came up in conversation, I described myself as doing contract work, which was true, and I let the vagueness do its work. My attorney, the one who handled my business formation and my contracts, was a woman named Renata Fuji. I had found her through a colleague 2 years before going independent, and she is the most methodical person I have ever worked with, which is the highest compliment I know how to give. Renata reviewed every client agreement before I signed it. She structured my business entity properly. She was the one who, in a meeting about 6 months before the afternoon of 85 missed calls, first raised the question of what Dollars estate planning looked like and whether I had any visibility into it. "I'm not trying to alarm you," Renata told me, leaning back in her chair with the measured calm she always projects. "But based on what you've described about the family dynamics, it might be worth having a quiet conversation with an estate attorney, not to interfere, just to understand the landscape." That was when I called Daniel Osei. The first close call happened at Dollars' house on a Sunday afternoon in October, about 7 months before everything collapsed into the open. I had come for what Dollars called a family lunch, which meant me, Lily, Dollars, Frank, Connie, and Derek, who had recently moved back to the area after a divorce and was spending more time at his father's house than anyone had quite anticipated. I had brought Lily's scooter because the driveway was long and smooth, and she loved it. And while Lily rode back and forth on the driveway, the adults sat on the porch with iced tea and talked about nothing consequential for about an hour. And then Connie said, with the particular brightness she uses when she is working towards something, "Nora, I heard you've been doing really well with your work lately. Someone at the Meridian Group mentioned your name." The Meridian Group was one of my clients, a significant one. I kept my expression exactly where it was. "People say nice things," I told her. "They said more than nice things." Connie tilted her head. "They said you handled their entire vendor contract restructuring. That's a big project." "I do a lot of different things," I said. I picked up my iced tea. "How's the leasing market right now? I know commercial has been unpredictable." Connie's mouth moved toward an answer before she caught herself, and I watched her recalibrate and decide that her own market was more interesting to discuss than mine, and she pivoted, and the moment passed. But Dollars had been listening. I knew she had been listening because she was holding her glass with both hands and she was very still, which is what she does when she is paying attention to something she has not yet decided what to make of. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in her car seat within 4 minutes of leaving the driveway, and I called Renata's office and left a message asking for a check-in that week. We met on Wednesday. I told her about the Meridian Group mention. She nodded once, slowly, and said, "Let's make sure your client agreements all have the standard confidentiality language. Tighten anything that needs tightening." I went home and reviewed every active client file. 3 of them needed updated language. Renata's office turned the revised agreements around within 8 business days. I did not just dodge that close call. I advanced because of it. The second close call was sharper and came from a direction I had not anticipated. Derek Bellamy, Frank's son, who is not related to me in any way except by his father's marriage to my grandmother, had apparently decided, sometime in the winter, that he and I were becoming friends. He started texting me occasionally. Nothing alarming at first, just comments about things that came up at family gatherings, the occasional forwarded article about logistics industry trends that told me he was paying attention to what I did in a way I had not invited. In February, he called me, which was unusual, and asked if I wanted to have coffee, just to catch up, and I said yes because saying no would have required an explanation I did not want to give. We met at a coffee place on Harlow Street on a Thursday morning. He was already there when I arrived, and he had already ordered, which told me something about how he had prepared for the conversation. He asked me 3 questions in the first 15 minutes that were wrapped in the language of casual curiosity, but were, structurally, the kind of questions you ask when you are trying to establish the size of something. How many clients did I typically manage at once? Was I looking to grow or stay boutique? Had I ever considered bringing on partners? I answered everything with enough truth to be credible and enough vagueness to be useless. I told him I liked to keep things manageable. I told him growth was always interesting to think about. I told him that partnership structures were complicated and I had always been more comfortable with independence. He nodded after each answer with the expression of a man who is very slightly disappointed but cannot say so. And then, with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, he said, "I only ask because Frank and my grandmother, Dollars, were talking about whether you might need some support. Capital, maybe. Someone in your corner who understands the financial side." I looked at him across the table for a moment. The word grandmother had slipped out before he corrected it. He knew it had slipped. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "That's very thoughtful," I told him. "I'm in good shape, but I'll keep it in mind." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. I drove home from that coffee meeting and sat in my car in my parking garage for 4 minutes before going upstairs. Then I called Daniel Osei and scheduled the follow-up conversation we had been meaning to have. We met the following week, and what Daniel told me about the structure of Dollars' estate, about the trust documents she had signed, and the specific inheritance clauses within them, and the revisions that were possible under the terms, settled something in my chest that I had been carrying without naming for a long time. I had been right to pay attention. And now I had paid enough attention to know exactly what was at stake. Everything I had built was about to be tested in a room where my daughter was supposed to be asleep, and the woman who had the power to rewrite the terms of our future had no idea what I had spent 3 years quietly preparing for. The afternoon Dollars decided to rewrite her will, she had called it a family lunch. That was what the text message said, the one that came to my phone on a Saturday morning in early April, sent from Frank's number because Dollars had never learned to type on her phone without producing autocorrect disasters. "Family lunch Sunday, 1 o'clock, come hungry, Lily too." 7 words that felt ordinary enough that I almost read them the way you read a weather notification, noted, filed, irrelevant to anything urgent. I should tell you what I knew by that Sunday. I knew, from my conversation with Daniel Osei, that Dollars had an existing estate plan, a trust document she and my grandfather had created decades before, which had been updated once after his death and once again after her marriage to Frank. I knew that in its most recent iteration, the trust named me as a primary beneficiary of the real estate portfolio and a secondary beneficiary of the liquid assets. I knew this because my father had been the primary beneficiary before he passed, and the language had rolled to me, and no one had seen any reason to change it. I also knew, because Daniel had done the research and told me with the careful neutrality of a man who understands that some news requires a specific delivery, that Dollars had met with a different attorney, a man named Gerald Chu, whose practice was in the same building as Connie Bellamy Walsh's leasing office, on 2 separate occasions in the preceding 4 months. Daniel could not tell me what those meetings were about. He did not need to. I had done enough math. So I went to the family lunch on Sunday. I brought Lily. I brought a fruit salad because Dollars had once mentioned in passing that store-bought desserts gave her indigestion, and I had never stopped remembering it. I dressed Lily in her yellow dress, the one she chose herself from 3 options, and she wore it with pink socks that did not match, which she also chose herself, and I let her because she is 6 years old and she should be allowed to make some decisions uncontested. We arrived at Dollars' house at 12:55. Frank's car was in the driveway. Connie's car was there. Derek's newer car, the one he had bought after the divorce, was parked on the street. A 4th car I did not immediately recognize was pulled up behind Derek's, a silver sedan with a magnetic parking permit from a downtown office building clipped to the visor. I noted the 4th car. I noted it the way you note an exit sign when you enter a building, not because you plan to use it immediately, but because you want to know where it is. Inside, the house smelled like the roast chicken Dollars always made for gatherings, and Frank was in the kitchen being enthusiastically unhelpful, and Connie was setting the table with the focused energy of someone who has decided that table setting is a performance of domestic authority. Derek was on the back porch on his phone. And sitting in the living room in the armchair that faces the front door was a man I had not met before, mid-50s, thinning hair, a leather portfolio case on the ottoman in front of him. He stood when I walked in. "Mrs. Scott," he extended his hand. "I'm Gerald Chu. I'm Dollars' estate attorney." I shook his hand. I kept my face at the exact temperature of polite neutrality. "Nice to meet you," I told him. Lily pressed close to my leg and looked at Gerald Chu with the frank evaluative stare that 6-year-olds deploy without any self-consciousness. He smiled at her. She did not smile back. Dollars came in from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she kissed me on the cheek, and she told Lily she looked beautiful, which made Lily say, "I know, I picked it," which made everyone laugh, and for 20 minutes it was just a family lunch. That is the thing about moments that change everything, they rarely announce themselves. They sit inside ordinary meals, wearing the same face as 100 other ordinary meals, and you only recognize them afterward by the shape of what they left behind. Lunch was served. We sat. Gerald Chu sat at the table too, which was unusual in a way nobody acknowledged out loud. I had placed Lily at the end nearest the hall because the chair there had a booster cushion that Dollars kept specifically for her, and she could eat and look at her placemat, which had animals on it, and be comfortable and contained and not particularly absorbed in adult conversation. I had thought, arriving, that she might finish eating and ask to go watch something on the small television in the guest room. Dollars had a tablet in there that Lily liked, and that is what happened. Lily ate most of her chicken and all of her fruit salad, and then she said, "Grandma Dollars, can I go watch the nature show?" And Dollars smiled and said of course, and Lily slid down from her chair and went down the hall and turned left into the guest room, and I heard the soft sound of the door not quite closing. And then I heard the tablet come on with its startup chime. What I did not know, what none of the adults at the table knew, was that Lily had not found the nature show. She had found that the tablet's battery was low and it had shut itself off almost immediately. And being 6 and resourceful and not wanting to disturb the adults, she had simply lain down on the guest bed to wait, and she had fallen asleep. At the table, the conversation shifted. It shifted the way I had known it was going to shift the moment I saw Gerald Chu's leather portfolio on the ottoman. Dollars set down her fork, and she looked at me and she said, "Nora, I want to talk about the future, about some decisions I've been thinking about for a while." Connie's hands were in her lap. She was looking at the table. Frank was looking at his water glass. "Of course," I told Dollars. "I've been working with Gerald on revising some things." Dollars folded her dish towel the way she always does when she is building towards something she finds uncomfortable, once lengthwise, then again. "The estate plan, I want it to reflect my actual family. The people who are present in my life, who have really been here." I waited. "Frank's children," she stopped, started again. "Connie and Derek have been remarkable. They have made my life fuller than I expected at this point, and I feel that my estate plan should acknowledge that." "That makes sense," I told her, because it did, and because I had expected it. What I had not expected was what she said next. What she said next was something that I think she had not planned to say at the table, with Gerald Chu sitting right there, and Frank watching his water glass, and Connie studying the tablecloth. I think it came out of her, the way things come out of people when they have been telling themselves a story for long enough that the story starts to feel like truth. The thing is, Dolores said, her voice dropping into the register of someone who believes they are being very honest and very brave, Lily is not my real granddaughter. Not truly. She's not Gordon's blood. She doesn't carry the family forward the way I'd hoped. The table was completely still. I absorbed this. I absorbed it the way you absorb a physical impact, by going very quiet inside, by cataloging the pain separately from the response, by deciding in a matter of seconds what the response was going to be. Frank looked up from his water glass. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, but the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had decided that knowing about it and stopping it were two different things. He looked back down. Derek, across the table, turned his head away toward the window. His jaw shifted. Connie still had her hands in her lap. She looked up once at Dolores and then back down. She did not say anything. She had the expression of someone who had helped build something they are now slightly afraid of. I understood the mechanism, watching them. Frank's silence was the silence of a man who had chosen his wife over a grandchild he had no blood tie to. A choice I found cowardly, but at least comprehensible. Derek looked away because he had enough decency to be uncomfortable and not enough to intervene. Connie had been the one steering Dolores toward this outcome for months, and now that it was happening out loud, in the open, in front of me, she had the particular stillness of someone who has won and does not quite know what to do with their hands. Gerald Chu had his portfolio open. He had a pen. He was very carefully not looking at me. I looked at my grandmother across the table, and I said with complete steadiness, "I see." I think, Dolores touched the folded dish towel. "I think you'll be fine, Nora. You've always been capable. I want the people who need the security to have it." That was when the door at the end of the hall opened. I heard it before I saw it. The small sound of the guest room door swinging wide, and then the sound of small feet on the wooden floor, and then Lily appeared at the edge of the dining room. Her yellow dress was wrinkled from the bed. One of her pink socks had folded down at the ankle. She was holding her rabbit. Her eyes were clear and fully awake, the way a child's eyes look when they have slept and come back into the world without the grogginess adults feel, just present, just there, just watching. She looked at me. And then she looked at Dolores. And there was something on her face that I did not entirely understand in the moment, a quality of having already processed something, which later, much later, I would understand had everything to do with how long she had been lying in that room before she fell asleep. The guest room was at the end of a short hall. The dining room table, where we had been sitting, was not far from the entrance to that hall. And Dolores, who is 81 and whose voice projects more than she realizes when she is making a declaration she has prepared herself to make, had said what she had said at a volume that, in a quiet house, traveled. Lily walked to Dolores' chair. She stood beside it. She leaned up toward Dolores' ear, the way Lily does when she is telling a secret because she is 6 and secrets are still delivered that way, cupped hands, bent knees, careful whisper. She whispered something, 4 or 5 words. I could not hear them from where I sat. Dolores went very still, not still the way the table had gone still. A different kind of still, the kind that starts in the chest and moves outward, the kind that belongs to someone who has been caught in the middle of something they cannot now unsay. She looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her with the calm openness of a child who has not yet learned that there are things you are not supposed to say. "You heard me say," Dolores stopped. Her hand came up and pressed flat against her collarbone. Lily said very clearly, because she is 6 and does not modulate for adult discomfort, "You said I'm not real family. I heard you when I was in the bed." Nobody at that table moved. I stood up. That was the moment. Not the moment of the confrontation that came next. This was the moment of the decision, the internal hinge that you can feel swinging when it happens, the moment when every strategic calculation I had been running for 3 years simplified into a single, clear point. She had said it where my daughter could hear it. That changed the terms of everything. I picked up my phone from beside my plate. I opened my contacts. I called Renata Fuji and the call went to her answering service, but I left a message in a voice that was completely level because I was completely level. I said her name. I said mine. I said, "I need to move the timeline up. Please call me tonight when you have a moment." Then I hung up. I looked at Dolores. "We should talk," I told her. "Not now because Lily is here and I'm going to take her home, but we should talk. And Gerald," I turned to the attorney who had stopped pretending to write and was now simply watching, "I'd like you to be there when we do, with your copy of the documents." Gerald Chu looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. He said, carefully, Mrs. Scott, I represent Dollars. I know who you represent. I'll have my own attorney present. I just want to make sure we're all looking at the same paperwork. I put my phone in my pocket. What day works for everyone? Nobody answered. Frank looked at Connie. Connie had her eyes on the wall. I took Lily's hand and I kissed Dollars on the cheek because she is 81 and she is still my blood grandmother regardless of what she had just done, and I walked my daughter to the car. Lily climbed into her seat. I buckled her in. She looked at me through the headdress gap with those clear, awake eyes. Was Grandma Dollars wrong? She asked. I looked at her for a moment. Yes, I told her. She was wrong. Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone who is still working out how wrong things are supposed to be handled. Then she tucked her rabbit under her arm and looked out the window. I drove home. I called Renata again. This time she picked up. File everything, I told her before she could say anything. The original timeline, the business documentation, all of it. I want to be ready to sit down with them by the end of the week. A brief pause. What happened? She said it in front of Lily. Another pause, shorter. I'll have everything ready by Wednesday morning. If you are still with me, stay, because what happened at that Wednesday meeting is the reason I am telling you this story. The meeting took place in Renata's conference room at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday in mid-April. Dollars arrived with Frank and Gerald Chu. Connie had asked to come, and Dollars had apparently said yes, because Connie came in behind them in a gray blazer she had pressed specifically for the occasion. I noticed because there was still a faint crease line at the shoulder where the steam iron had pressed too hard. Derek had not come. I thought about that later, what it said about Derek that he had decided not to be present. I was already there when they arrived. Renata was next to me. Across the table, stacked in a neat arrangement that Renata had prepared the evening before, were 3 sets of documents. I did not look at them after I had reviewed them that morning. I knew what was in them. I had been living with that knowledge for a long time. Dollars sat across from me. She looked, if I am being precise about it, like a woman who had rehearsed a difficult conversation and was now discovering that the room was arranged differently than she had imagined. She looked at the document stacks. She looked at Renata. She looked at me. I'm glad you agreed to meet, she said. Her voice was controlled. I think there are some things that need to be said directly. There are, I agreed. Gerald Chu set his own portfolio on the table. He uncapped his pen. Frank folded his hands in front of him like a man trying to communicate that he is present but officially neutral. Connie pulled her blazer straight across her shoulders. I want you to understand, Nora, Dollars began, that this isn't about not loving you. The changes I'm making to the estate plan are about what makes sense for my life now, for the family I have now. Frank is my husband. His children have been. I understand what you're doing, I told her. I want to make sure you understand what it means. A pause. Gerald Chu's pen stayed still. What it means. Dollars repeated the phrase the way people repeat things when they are not sure whether they are hearing a threat or an observation. Renata opened the first document stack and slid a copy across the table toward Gerald. Let me start with the trust itself, she said, specifically with the language that was established in the original filing regarding the biological line of succession. Gerald picked up the document. He began scanning it. His expression, which had been professionally pleasant, acquired a particular focused quality, the look of an attorney who has just spotted something in a document that they know is going to complicate the next 10 minutes. The trust, Renata continued, as currently written, contains a clause that was standard in instruments of this type when it was originally drafted. The biological line of succession clause establishes that changes to beneficiary status for family members connected by blood require a 21-day written notice period, during which the original beneficiary has the right to request a formal mediation before any modification is executed. She let that sit for a moment. That notice was never sent. Dollars turned to Gerald. Gerald, is that? He was still looking at the document. He turned to a second page, then a third. He set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not want to tip his hand. There are some procedural questions, he allowed, that I'd want to review more carefully. There's also the matter of the meeting itself, Renata continued, and she slid a second set of documents across, not to Gerald, but to Dollars directly. On Sunday, you met with Lily present in the house. The modifications you discussed were discussed in a setting where your biological granddaughter, a child, was present and heard the content of the conversation. In a jurisdiction that takes fiduciary conduct seriously, the context of a modification discussion matters. Dollars looked at the papers in front of her. Her reading glasses were in her purse. She reached for them and put them on, and for a moment she looked small in a way I had never seen her look, not frail, but reduced, as though some essential certainty she had always occupied had shifted slightly off its foundation. "I didn't know she was awake," Dollars said. It came out quieter than everything she had said before. "I know you didn't." I kept my voice at exactly the temperature of factual. "I want to be clear that I'm not here today to punish you for it. I'm here because after Sunday, there are some things you need to understand about where I actually stand, so that whatever decisions you make going forward, you're making them with accurate information." Connie uncrossed and recrossed her legs. Frank's hands tightened against each other, a small compression that he released almost immediately. I nodded to Renata. She opened the third document stack and laid it flat on the table. This was the one that mattered. This was 3 years of building, filed correctly, structured properly, documented all the way back. "This," Renata said, addressing the table generally, "is the current operating summary of Nora's consulting practice. It has been in formal operation for 2 years and 8 months. Its current annual revenue is $431,000. Its current client roster includes 7 companies, 4 of which have multi-year contracts. Its net operating assets, including retained earnings and the current contract forward schedule, are valued at approximately $1.1 million. The room did something interesting then. Gerald Chu, who had been maintaining the careful composure of a professional, stopped writing. Not slowed down, stopped. His pen was still touching the paper, but it had stopped moving, and he had tilted his head the way people tilt their heads when they are recalibrating. Connie's hand went to the collar of her blazer. She touched it once and then dropped her hand back to the table. Frank opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at his wife. Dollars was looking at the document. Her reading glasses were still on. She was not reading it, she was looking at it the way you look at something when the looking itself is the experience, when the numbers on the page are doing the speaking and your job is only to receive them. "I've been running this practice," I told my grandmother, "since about 3 months before Lily started preschool. The year you told me to consider a public pre-K program because the tuition wasn't a good use of my money, I had already closed enough in contracts that quarter to pay Lily's tuition for the next 4 years. I didn't say anything because it wasn't relevant to what you were saying. You were trying to help, the way you understood helping." Dollars took her glasses off. She set them on the table next to the document. "I also want you to know," I continued, "that Lily's 529 educational savings account currently holds $67,000. I opened it the week after that preschool conversation. It's in her name, managed through a trustee account, and it has been growing steadily for 4 years. She is taken care of. She has always been taken care of." "Nora," Dollars' voice had changed. Not broken, that would come later, but changed, in the way that a structure changes when one of its weight-bearing elements shifts. "I didn't know, I know you didn't know, that's what I'm trying to tell you." A silence settled over the conference room, not the social kind of silence, the kind that is actually made of sound beneath it, of breath and paper and the city noise filtering through the windows. A different kind. The kind that belongs to a room where something has been understood that cannot be ununderstood. Connie was the one who broke it. She leaned forward slightly, and her voice came out with the particular quality of someone who is trying to reframe a conversation they are losing. "None of this changes Dollars' right to manage her own estate the way she sees fit. She can change the will. She can," Renata said. "Absolutely. After the 21-day notice period, which we can initiate today if she'd like. And after a review of the trust's foundational clauses, which Gerald and I can work through together." She looked at Gerald with the friendly, precise expression of one attorney acknowledging another's professional understanding of the situation. "Is that your read as well, Gerald?" Gerald pressed his lips together. He looked at Dollars. He said, carefully, "There are some procedural steps that would need to be properly sequenced before any modification could be finalized." Connie sat back. The blazer shifted at her shoulders. Dollars had been looking at her hands, which were flat on the table in front of her. She looked up at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. It was a real question. Not defensive, real. The kind of question that comes from someone who is starting to understand, very slowly and not comfortably, that the person sitting across from them has been living a life they knew nothing about. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the birthday party and the preschool conversation and the coffee shop meeting Derek had arranged, and I thought about Connie touching Dolar's forearm in that particular way. I thought about my father and about how much he had loved his mother and about how grief does strange things to people's judgment. Because every time I showed you something I'd built, I told her, you found a way to advise it, to suggest someone I should talk to or a way I should reconsider it or a risk I hadn't thought about. And what I built, this practice, this life, I needed it to stay mine. I needed to build it without anyone's fingerprints on it but mine. I paused. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it so you understand why the people who have been here, as you put it, may not have always been here for the reasons you thought. Dolores turned her head toward Connie. It was a slow movement, measured, the kind that suggests the person making it is not entirely sure what they are going to find when they complete it. Connie met her gaze for approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked down at the table. That was the moment I watched something shift in Dolores, not dramatically, not the way breakdowns look in movies, but in the specific internal way that they actually happen. A compression behind the eyes, a very slight pulling of the lips inward, as though the face is reorganizing itself around a new understanding. Her hand came up from the table, and she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, just there, just briefly. Frank reached over and put his hand on her arm. It was the most genuine thing he had done all morning, and I noted it. What? Dolores stopped, cleared her throat. What is it that you want from today, Nora? What are you asking for? I'm not asking for anything. I kept my voice even, without triumph in it, because triumph would have been the wrong note entirely. I'm asking you to have accurate information. I'm asking you to know that Lily is provided for, completely and independently of anything in your estate plan. I'm asking you to understand that the people who have been encouraging these changes have a financial interest in them that is not the same as your interest. I looked at her directly. And I'm asking you to think about what my father would have said, if he had been in this room, about what was said in front of his granddaughter on Sunday. No one in the room spoke. Dolores' 2 fingers were still at her temple. Gerald Chu was looking at the wall. Frank's hand was still on Dolores' arm. Connie had both hands flat on the table now, and she was very still, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the rapid, unpleasant arithmetic of someone who has realized that the move they planned for has been anticipated and documented and is now sitting in 3 paper stacks on a conference table. Renata gave it another 10 seconds, and then she said, quietly, "We can give everyone a few minutes if that would be helpful." Dolores said, "Yes." It came out like an exhale. Renata and I stepped into the hallway. We stood there, not saying much, listening to the muffled, indistinct sounds of a conversation happening in the room behind us, Dolores' voice, lower than usual, and Frank's, and then a shorter, sharper exchange that included Connie's voice going up at one point in a way that then flattened again. 7 minutes passed. Then Gerald opened the conference room door and asked us to come back in. Dolores looked like someone who had set something down that had been very heavy. Not relieved, lighter is not always the same as relieved, but different. The particular difference of someone who has stopped carrying a thing they had convinced themselves they wanted to carry. "I want to talk to Renata about the notice period," she said. "Properly. Gerald is going to stay and go through the procedural requirements with her." She looked at me. "And I want to talk to you, Nora. Not today. When I've had some time to think." "I'm available whenever you're ready," I told her. She nodded. Her hands were in her lap now, and she was pressing the folded dish towel. She had brought it in her bag, I realized, the way she always carries something to do with her hands when she is nervous, and she was folding and unfolding the edge of it. Her tell. Present twice, 3 times over the course of the morning. I had seen it my whole life and only now understood what it always meant. I walked to the door. I stopped. "Dolores," she looked up. "Lily asked me last night if you liked her rabbit. I told her I'd ask." Something moved across Dolores' face that I will not try to name because I don't think names do it justice. It started at the corners of her eyes and moved down, and she pressed her lips together and she said, "Tell her I think the rabbit is wonderful." I nodded. I left. The days that followed moved with the specific, grinding deliberateness of legal process, which does not care about emotional significance and proceeds on its own schedule regardless of how much any of the people involved would prefer resolution to come faster. Renata and Gerald worked through the procedural requirements over the following 2 weeks. The 21-day notice period was formally initiated. During that period, Dolores made 2 phone calls to me, both short, both careful, both carrying the quality of a woman learning how to speak to someone she realizes she had fundamentally misread. Connie Bellamy Walsh did not call me. What she did, within 10 days of the conference room meeting, was have a very significant argument with Dollars that Dollars later described to me in one careful, elliptical sentence as having clarified a number of things. Frank told me slightly more in the parking lot of Dollars' house on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after the meeting, while Lily played on the driveway with her scooter. He stood next to me and looked at his shoes and said, "She asked Gerald to look into whether the changes Connie had suggested would have created any," he used the word asymmetry, in the distribution, "between his kids and you. Gerald told her what he found." I waited. "It would have been significant," Frank said, "in Connie's favor." I looked at him. He was a man who had made choices I found cowardly and choices I found genuine, sometimes within the same hour, which is probably true of most people. "Thank you for telling me," I said. He nodded once and went back inside. The estate plan was not revised against me. The 21-day period expired without a formal modification proceeding. Gerald Chu sent Renata a letter confirming that his client had determined no changes to beneficiary status would be made at this time. Renata forwarded it to me with a single line, "As expected. What happened to Connie is the part that I had no hand in and no responsibility for, which I want to be clear about. What happened to Connie happened because Dollars is, under everything, a careful and intelligent woman, and because Gerald Chu is a competent attorney who, when asked by his client to review the implications of her stepdaughter-in-law's suggested modifications, found that those modifications would have restructured the trust in a way that benefited Connie's leasing business, which had a financial relationship with two of the properties in Dollars' portfolio, in ways that were not immediately obvious but were. Once you looked at them, not subtle. Dollars confronted Connie directly. I know because Dollars told me so in the third phone call she made to me, which was longer than the first two. Connie denied it, then walked it back, then said she had been trying to protect the family's interests. Dollars told her, in what I imagine was a very quiet and very final voice, that she would need time away from that relationship. Connie stopped coming to Sunday lunches. Derek still comes occasionally. The dynamic is different, which is the most honest way I know how to describe what shifted. Dollars and I had our conversation, the real one, the long one, on a Tuesday evening at her house when Lily was at a playdate, and we had 2 hours and no one else present. It was not comfortable. It was not the kind of conversation that ends with everything repaired, because some things do not repair so much as they find a different shape. She told me she had missed my father every day since he died, and that I looked like him around the eyes in a way that sometimes made it hard. I told her I knew. She told me she had not meant to make Lily feel like less, that the words had come out wrong, that she had been frightened and had said the frightened thing rather than the true thing. I told her that frightened things said out loud in houses where children are sleeping still land where they land, and she would need to say something to Lily herself if she wanted to move forward. She did. The following weekend, she asked Lily to sit with her in the garden, and she said, in the careful, simple language that Lily later reported to me with complete faithfulness, "I said something that wasn't true, and I'm sorry. You are my real granddaughter." "Okay?" Lily looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, can I have some of your garden tomatoes?" Dollars laughed. "A real one. My practice continues to grow. This year I brought on a second consultant, a woman named Britta Solano, who I met through the Meridian Group and who is, frankly, better at client development than I am, which is exactly why I hired her. Our combined billings for the first quarter were the strongest we have had. Lily turned 7 in March, and she is in first grade at the same school I chose for her preschool, and she recently announced that she wants to study animals when she grows up, specifically the kind that live in rivers. Her 529 account has cleared $73,000. Her rabbit has been repaired twice, once at the ear, once at the nose, and she still sleeps with it every night. I don't carry what happened in that dining room the way I expected to. I thought it would be heavier. But the thing about being prepared, really prepared, not just hoping for the best, is that when the moment comes, you have already done the work. The emotion comes later, after the logistics are handled, and by the time it arrives, it is smaller than you feared. I called Dollars on her birthday last month. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. She asked about Lily's rabbit. I told her the ear had held up. Some people have told me I should have confronted all of this sooner. That I let it go too long. Maybe. But I did not have what I needed until I had it, And what I had, the documentation, the practice, the legal groundwork, the 3 years of building in silence, was the reason that when it finally mattered, I did not have to raise my voice once. So I'll let you decide. Did I take too long, or did I take exactly long enough? Tell me in the comments.